Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming to the University of Denver Intellectual Property meeting, and we are thrilled that you're joining us this afternoon. And what we'll do is first I'll introduce, my name is Yvonne Sharena Pacheco, Associate Director of Admissions, and May Peterson is also navigating us, and hopefully once you have the chat room set up, people can enter questions. And I will introduce now our two speakers. Okay, I just want to make sure everyone is set. Okay, Professor Aviva Moffett. And Professor Moffett was also our Dean of Academic Affairs for several years, and she welcomed coming back to the classroom and being with the students. And then we have Professor Bernard Chow. And so what we'll do is each will give an introduction of themselves, how long they've been at the University of Denver Sturm College of Law, and the courses that they teach or have taught, and the research or scholarship that they have worked on. And then we'll open it up if they have any comments to make, and then we'll open it up to questions and answers.
Great, thanks Yvonne, and welcome everyone. It's great to, well, I can't see you, but I can see that you're here on this screen, and it's great to see so many people with an interest in intellectual property law. This is my 16th year, I believe, teaching at the University of Denver Law School, and as Yvonne suggested, I really love teaching. I spent some time doing administrative work for the law school, but now I'm back in the classroom, and I really love teaching, and especially love teaching intellectual property law. I also teach contract law to first-year students, so some of you who will be with us in the next year may have me for a contract law, which would also be really fun. I teach, in addition to contracts, the intellectual property survey course. I teach copyright law, I teach trademark law, I've taught remedies, which involves all subjects, and a couple other courses over time, but that's my main package of courses. And I also research and write in the areas of mostly copyright and trademark law and a little bit of trade secret law, and that really reflects the things I'm interested in, as well as my practice. I was a litigator, or primarily a litigator, for about 8 years before I came to the law school, and I practiced law in San Francisco, and then I moved to Colorado, and I practiced law in Colorado as well. And in both cases, I did mostly litigation, a lot of trade secret work, trademark work, copyright work, and a little bit of transactional work. I advise clients about sort of intellectual property matters, in addition to handling litigation matters. And I really, I loved practicing law, but I really love teaching and thinking about intellectual property law. So I'm very happy to be where I am now, and very happy to see so many of you, as I said, interested in intellectual property law. So I'm glad to answer any questions that you have here, and also happy to talk on the phone or by Zoom or over email with any of you if you have particular questions that you want to get answered. So I'll end there for now and hand it over to Professor Chow.
Hi everyone. So you guys can hear me? Yeah. Okay. Good. No, my mic just it flashed at me. It changed my mic. But anyway, so I'm Bernard Chow. I also teach contracts to a lot of first years, and we'll be teaching contracts this fall. I also my sort of upper level courses are patent law and privacy law, and that's like data privacy and cybersecurity. My background is one of Silicon Valley. You'll find that, I don't know, half the intellectual property professors around the country worked in San Francisco or Silicon Valley before they became professors. And I worked in Silicon Valley for about 20 years doing patent litigation, startup work, and then just intellectual property counseling. My research, so I've been here at DU teaching law for about 10 years. I started out primarily focusing my research on patent law, and of course I teach the patent law course. I think my sort of interests have emerged to be a little broader than that, so that I am generally interested in law and technology and intellectual property as it relates primarily to the high-tech world, in the high-tech space. And that's part of the reason why I've taken on the data privacy class. I find that area to be particularly fascinating and important in this modern age. And then finally, I have another line of research that I deal with crowdsourcing and jury decision-making, basically doing experiments online, hiring 1,000 people to look at my videos and trials. But I'm eager to talk about intellectual property in our program today. How shall we proceed here?
Okay, we're going to thank you, Professors Moffitt and Chow. What we'll do is May will start by asking the questions. She'll ask you all 3 questions. If the question is directed to one of you in particular, she will make that known, and then I'll take the next set of questions. So May, thank you.
We had some questions that we had talked about previously as well. So we might go through a few of those as well. So a question for you both. How can students get involved in the IP program as a 1L?
Well, I can jump in there. There's multiple things that you can do in your 1L year. I want to say first that I encourage all students to really focus on their 1L courses in their first year, and that's really important in terms of establishing a foundation for everything else, including your IP practice that will come after that. But there are still plenty of opportunities for students in their 1L year, including the Intellectual Property Law Society, which is very active, has events and speakers, and 1Ls can be members of that group. And there are other general events that happen. Professor Chow, maybe you can speak to the Inn of Court and students' access to that.
Right. So there are 2 primary ways that we get students involved with the intellectual property bar in Colorado. One, and probably the foremost, is the Intellectual Property Inn of Court. That is basically a organization in Colorado where practicing intellectual property attorneys sort of help mentor younger attorneys and students. Each year they allow both DU and CU to have each 10 students be members. We typically accept applications in the spring of each year, and then what we'll have is a series of meetings from September to May, where students are often involved in presentation and substantive programs. They meet, the actual Inn meets once a month, actually the 3rd Thursday of every month at 5:30 p.m. And they provide a 1-hour substantive meeting that is actually put together by the Inn members itself, often with significant input by students and the junior attorneys. And then there's, on both the front end and the back end, there's sort of happy hour and socializing, so that we have a combination of sort of getting learning as well as meeting a lot of attorneys. I typically recommend that you try to join for your second year. First years actually aren't allowed, so, but we do occasionally, or we do allow guests to come, like, so you can be a guest during your first year if you're interested, and I would actually sort of recommend that to be toward the end of your first year. The other organization is the Colorado Bar IP section. It's a little less active, but they do have Wednesday lunch. I think it's Wednesday lunches once a month that are free to students, and typically they bring in speakers from around the country to talk about different IP topics. And that's usually at the Chop House downtown. Sometimes it's a little problematic with your schedule, or with certain 1L schedules, but it is something that you can sort of get a taste of.
Great, thank you. Can you speak to how you feel that Denver Law's IP program is separated or separates itself from other competing IP programs?
I'll start here. So I think the thing that separates DU law generally, and in particular with the intellectual property program, is actually our incredibly strong relationship with the Colorado Bar. So you'll be assigned mentors from the Colorado Bar right off the bat. But the intellectual property program is, by being involved in situations like the Inn and having externships available with law firms in Colorado, it's much easier to work with and learn about the Colorado Intellectual Property Bar based here. A lot of students, in fact, most of the students do intellectual property internships that are interested in intellectual property while they're here, and often they do externships. For example, one of the 4 regional patent offices is based in Denver. We typically have an extern there every semester, and we have externs at local law firms as well as local technology businesses like CenturyLink and the like. So I think there's a lot of opportunities to really get a kind of relationship with local attorneys that's not easily available in bigger cities with multiple law schools. I mean, and I think part of this is that DU is the only law school in town.
And the other, just to follow up on that, the other related piece of that is that in addition to Professor Chow and I, we have an incredibly strong adjunct faculty group in the intellectual property area. So what that means is students can take classes with local practicing intellectual property lawyers, which means that this is really part of this connection with the Denver Bar, that our students are really able to meet and get to know and often get jobs with the faculty, the adjunct faculty who teach the classes at the law school. So it provides just this great community and set of connections.
Great, thank you. So you did mention the USPTO. Can you talk a little bit more about some of the other externship placements that are available and if they're competitive to secure?
Yeah, so I would suggest that all of them are competitive to secure. The USPTO maybe is a little less so, just simply because we have students there every semester. But we have both at large and law firms, large and small law firms in Denver. We have externships all over the place. We also have we have, and the name is now escaping. We have several businesses, large businesses that regularly employ our students as externs, like Oracle, CenturyLink. There's a couple other that I'm probably missing. Level 3. So we have quite a number of those opportunities here.
Can you speak a little bit to the patent bar? Is this something that law students will need to take? If so, when? And do you provide any resources for patent bar preparation? Remind me if I don't get to all those questions. So the first thing is, the patent bar is important to employers for those students that are going to be being patent attorneys. Okay, if you don't already know, the patent bar requires to be a patent attorney that represents clients that apply for and obtain patents before the Patent and Trademark Office. We call that patent prosecution, which is sort of confusing because it's not at all like criminal prosecution. Patent prosecution requires a separate patent registration number with the Patent and Trademark Office, meaning that you have to take a test. You don't actually have to be an attorney to be a patent agent or have a registration number. You do have to have a technical background. That either means a technical degree or the credit hour equivalent of a technical degree. The Patent Office provides that information on their website about what are the acceptable degrees and what are the acceptable credit hour equivalents that work there. Employers love to have your students that are patent bars, that have their patent bar taken early. We actually always have a few students that take it during the summer before they even join law school, because that sort of lines them up for early externships or early internships. And typically, if you want, oftentimes you get externships for credit, but also you get internships for pay. Typically, if you want to get paid, which a lot of students naturally do, the employers like to see the patent bar there. So
our students take it, I always say take it as early as is manageable. If you're not doing something this summer, there are resources online that you can learn about how to take it. We don't provide specific courses for the patent bar itself. The intellectual property student group actually provides some support there because many students take it, they sort of all talk about it and they have their preferred materials that they use. The patent bar is actually quite different than what we teach because it tends to be very administrative, meaning they often just ask questions like how many months is the deadline to do blank, or what form do you use for blank? And we sort of teach more substance, and we don't teach like all the little paperwork details that is required by the patent bar.
Great, thank you. Can you talk a little bit about the IP certificate, and should students consider enrolling or applying for that certificate program?
Maybe I can talk a little bit about that. We do have an IP certificate. It requires 15 credits that you have to complete within the IP curriculum at the law school. It was designed to really sort of indicate to employers and others that if somebody's gotten the IP certificate, that they have a focus and expertise in the intellectual property area. So I certainly would say, I think if it's something you are sure you're interested in, it's definitely worth doing. But we have also designed it so that you can do other things while you're at the law school. So as I sort of already indicated, I'm really a believer in making sure that you have a broad foundation. All students have a broad foundation in the basic sort of doctrine that you need to do practice in any area of the law. So we explicitly designed the certificate in order to allow kind of both things, that is some specialization and a deep dive, and to be able to take advantage of the other things that we have at the law school. I saw on the chat, one of the questions was about whether you can do more than one concentration. It certainly would be possible to do the IP certificate and another certificate at the law school. Some of them require more credits, so that would be slightly more difficult, but there's certainly no reason why you couldn't do intellectual property and the international law certificate, for example, and some people do intellectual property and the corporate and commercial law certificate. So I think that that's an absolutely a possibility. And it is also something, it's not like you have to commit to it and then if you don't complete it, it's a problem, or if you haven't committed to it, if you complete all the requirements, you can still get the certificate. So it's a pretty flexible, approach that we've tried to take.
Great. So we did get a couple of advanced questions from students through our RSVP link. And so I'm gonna go ahead and ask those first, and then we can jump into our group chat questions as well. Can you speak to intellectual property as it relates to the fashion industry?
I guess I'll take that one. Not because I'm so fashionable, but it's an area that I'm interested in. And actually, for quite a long time, there was, and this is a short answer, and people who are interested in this should feel free to email me or find me, and we can talk about it in a little more depth. But for quite a long time, the short answer was there is no IP protection for fashion design, because fashion is, clothing is considered useful and therefore not protected by copyright law. And that changed a little bit with this Supreme Court opinion from about 2 years ago called Star Athletica, which was about, of all things, copyright protection for cheerleader uniforms. And the court did sort of open a little window, the Supreme Court opened a little window for some intellectual property, copyright protection for clothing design. And so I think it's sort of a evolving question now of how much that window will open and how much protection will really, as a practical matter, be available for those doing fashion design. But that's a great question, just because it points to some really recent developments in the law. And for example, I'm covering that in my copyright class this semester. So as I said, if somebody wants to follow up with me about that later, happy to chat more. Don't know if everyone is interested in fashion though.
we can make sure to have, I think Yvonne just posted emails for both Professor Chow and Professor Moffitt. So if you do have questions for follow-up individually, you can find their contact information there. And then the second question that we received, and I think that this has also been echoed a little bit in our group chat, so we might try to evolve the question a little bit more. Do you need an undergraduate degree in a STEM area to pursue IP law, or do you have recommendations for those that do not have that STEM background?
Yeah, so you do need a STEM background for one area of intellectual property. And that is patent prosecution. Not all patent law, but patent prosecution. And so to represent clients before the Patent and Trademark Office to obtain patents, you do need a STEM background. There are a lot of adjacent fields. Obviously, fashion, you're not going to need it in. A lot of copyright law, you don't need it in. Trademark law, you don't need it in. But some areas that you might expect to need it, you don't need it in either, which is patent litigation, which is to fight over patent rights in court as opposed to obtain rights, the patents from the Patent and Trademark Office. Data privacy does not require any kind of technical background, although I think having some healthy confidence or ability to just sort of feel comfortable about how computers work a little bit, firewalls, passwords, that kind of stuff is important. So many people at this stage that do not have technical backgrounds now have the sophistication to understand a little bit about computer security.
Okay, I have two questions, one for Professor Moffitt and one for Professor Chow. The one to Professor Moffitt, what prompted you to leave California to come to Colorado? And Professor Chow, what do you find distinct about the IP law industry in Denver versus Silicon Valley? So.
Well, maybe I'll go first since you asked me first, and it's really, I moved to Colorado for personal reasons, not professional reasons, although I have to tell you that I'm thrilled that I did so. And just to pivot to IP law a little bit, and maybe Professor Chow can take it from here, but in the time since I have moved to Colorado, I've actually lived here for 20 years now, the IP practice in Colorado has boomed, like literally, truly boomed, and become much more successful. I mean, I don't know about successful, sophisticated. And there are lots of IP lawyers, and I think a really pretty robust market for lawyers and law students interested in IP law. But Professor Chow can speak maybe a little bit more particularly to those differences.
So the question was, what's the difference between the intellectual property community in California and here? Was that the question? So I think there are a couple interesting aspects. I think one generally, to be frank, I think the obsessiveness about intellectual property that exists in Silicon Valley probably doesn't exist to as strong a degree here. And that means you work, intellectual property is an area where you work pretty hard. There are different, some law firms harder than others, some specialties harder than others, but overall pretty both well-paying but hard-working field. It can be brutal in Silicon Valley, and I think it is less so here. I think the other thing that is sort of nice from the Colorado perspective is two things. One is the opportunities here for junior attorneys are better, frankly, than they are in Silicon Valley because of the sort of the competition and sort of the intensity of it all. A lot of the assignments that you would think might go to junior attorneys actually are sort of sifted up the totem pole. And so I think you get actually better opportunities at a more junior level here. Finally, I'd say the community is smaller. It's not small by any stretch of the imagination. But at this point, and I would say even, I've been here about 10 years, but even like maybe 4 or 5 years, I knew many of the attorneys here that practice intellectual property. Not all of them, but if I went to a bar event, I would see people that I recognized within 4 or 5 years pretty often. Silicon Valley is vast in that respect. And so even though I practiced there 20 years, there'd often be conferences where I might know one or two people. It's just a totally different order of magnitude.
Thank you. Is there anything else, Professor Moffitt, that you'd like to add about the IP job market in the Denver area?
Well, so as I said, I think it's really, really grown since I moved here. That is, there's a much stronger tech presence in Colorado and in the Denver and the Front Range area in particular than there was 20 years. So I think the jobs in that way have really expanded. And as I said, I think the practice here has gotten much more sophisticated over time. But as Professor Chow says, it's really is still a very warm and welcoming community. I practice law here, but not for 16 years now, and I still, when I go to events, see people that I practiced with, that I worked with all the time, and I find it to be a very supportive and welcoming community, and a growing one. So our IP students, and I don't just mean the patent students, but people interested in copyright law. And I mean, copyright is a relatively small practice in Denver, but trademark law and trade secret law, and sort of generally representing corporations with their intellectual property matters has become, we've really had a very strong showing in the job market in Denver. And I don't expect that to really go away anytime soon.
Yeah, I do think, this answers a question that was asked earlier, or goes back to a question, which is that because our students get a chance to extern with law firms and businesses in their area, that means they get to work with them over the course of a semester. It's really like a semester-long interview, right? And the employers really appreciate that opportunity. You can imagine that I've actually literally had this conversation with a partner, compared interviewing students from out of state versus having externs from DU. They said, there's no choice. If you know that you have a really good student from DU because you've worked with them over the course of 3 or 4 months, there's no interview that you're going to have with a student from another school out of state that is going to give you that level of confidence, right? They may be just as good, but you just can't tell that in 3 hours of interviews going around the office and then having lunch with them. And I think that is a strong reason why we have such a good showing in the employment market in Colorado. And, as final evidence of that, when I go to now I feel a little bit of getting a few gray hairs. I go to a conference here. It's really sort of nice to see, 30% of the population almost being our graduates at any conference.
Great. How are U.S. intellectual property laws enforced when other countries are stealing intellectual property from American businesses?
I think you'll find that it is much more. The enforcement is stronger wherever intellectual property is being developed. So for years, actually, Asia was not actually enforcing intellectual property very well. Now China's actually the largest issuer of patents. They get the most patents. Chinese companies get the most patents in the world over IBM or any other, over any U.S. Group of companies. Those companies are actually getting more patents. What do you know? They're starting to enforce patents really strongly, and their laws are becoming more stringent there. Both countries have, both our countries, China, and other countries have hometown effects. In other words, they often treat their companies better, either consciously or unconsciously, or probably consciously, than other companies. But it's a real bare knuckle brawl, frankly, in courts and in policy debates and lobbying at every level, because so much money is at stake.
And historically speaking, developing countries have been less interested in acknowledging or following intellectual property laws than countries that are more developed. And the same is true of, as Professor Chow says, now that China's and some other Asian countries are producing more of their own intellectual property, they're much more interested in intellectual property laws. The same was true of the United States. where we were much less interested in thinking about other countries' intellectual property laws or rights until we started industrializing and creating our own technology. So it's a great question, I think interesting from a comparative perspective, from a historical perspective, and does get covered in some of the classes that we have at the law school.
Yeah, it should come as no surprise, for example, that intellectual property rights are fairly weak in some third world countries. But for the most part, at least the kind of technology that I focus on, we sort of ignore that as sort of leakage. You know, if you have patents on semiconductor equipment, you don't really care if Ethiopia doesn't really respect those patents. It's just not going to be a big part of your business.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to ask two more questions and give it over to May. Are the IP classes focused more on prosecution and litigation, or both?
Well, so as a general matter, law school courses tend to be, and this is, you can tell that there's part of me that's a historian, but as a historical matter, law schools started and still continue to be based substantially on what's called the case method. So you read cases and talk about them and think about the legal reasoning in the cases. And cases are all a result of disputes being litigated. And so what that means to some extent is that, this is a broader answer to a more narrow question, is that law school courses tend to be more focused on litigation generally, as opposed to administrative, regulatory, or transactional kinds of approaches to law. And so that's probably somewhat true in the intellectual property field as well. But we do offer some prosecution classes, and more generally, there are, we've worked really hard at the law school, especially in getting practical courses in transactional work. And I don't know, maybe Professor Chai, you can speak a little bit more to that.
Yeah, I mean, oftentimes when you talk about prosecution versus litigation, you're talking about patent law. So more generally, you're talking about obtaining rights versus enforcing rights. You know, so I can speak for the patent law. We try to actually bring a curriculum that is fairly balanced toward both kinds of practitioners. The basic patent course that I teach, I try to discuss it from both perspectives because I think they are different perspectives and important. But as you take more advanced classes, we actually offer both. We try to offer patent litigation and patent prosecution every other year, so that any student during their second and third year has the opportunity to take both of those classes. Those courses are both taught by adjuncts, but that gives you a sense that we really are trying to balance, give a balanced point of view for all types of attorneys.
Thank you. Is the IP in of courts entry competitive, and how are students placed in the externships, such as the patent office?
Yeah, so the IPN, of course, is not particularly competitive, but it really depends on year. So it depends on how many applicants. So the IPN of court basically does allow 10 students from DU each year. And that includes returning students. So that's essentially 5 a class. And what we found is that most years, that's pretty much how many students want to be in the IPN of court from DU. And that turns out to be true from CU as well. There are some years when we have a disproportionate number of students that are interested, and then it becomes competitive. That's not every year. Externships are totally different. Externships is more like you're interviewing. It's like an interview for a job. You're interviewing with a law firm or a company to get the opportunity to work with them. And depending on you can imagine, depending on the popularity of that law and the prestige of that firm or that company, it will be very competitive or it will be less competitive.
And we do work with, I know that question talked about working with the Career Center, so our Career Development Office and our externship program. They work very closely together, and because there is such a tight linkage between externships while you're in law school and then jobs that our students tend to get when they graduate from law school. And so those two groups work very closely together. And at the law school, you can have externships where you, and this it happens in some cases and not others, where you both get paid and get credit for those externships. And some externships are unpaid, but you get credit for them. Again, I think our students are quite successful at finding positions while they're in law school during the summers and then afterwards. And many times those are connected.
Great. So we did have a couple of questions that referenced clinical programs. So we've talked a lot about externships. Do you see a possibility of ever having an IP clinic at the law school?
Well, we've talked about it, and I know that there are students who continue to be interested in it, and so it's something that I would really like us to be able to develop. I'm not going to make any promises now, but there is, potentially one thing we've talked about is working in conjunction with the U.S. the Patent and Trademark Office, regional office that's in Denver, and those regional offices do have clinical programs that they do in conjunction with law schools. And so I think that there is a possibility of that, and I think that would be great. But again, I can't promise that will happen in the next 3 years. And I think we have felt like we've done a pretty good job of getting our students a lot of practical, hands-on experience while they're in law school. Both we have capstone courses where students work with adjunct faculty members on specific problems, and then the full range of the externships that our students do provide many sort of opportunities for experiential learning.
Great. And is there ever a possibility for students to be in more directed research positions where they're researching or conducting their own research in regard to intellectual property, specifically in something like privacy?
Yeah, so I mean, every semester I usually have a couple students doing directed research with me for credit. I typically, first of all, I never let first years do it, just to be clear. I highly discourage anyone before their second semester of their second year from doing it. In other words, what I want the students to have done is already taken some courses in intellectual property, and then be at a point where they're like going, hey, I'm not going to have the opportunity to learn this as well, and I'd like to learn more about that. And at that point, depending on fit, I think most of the faculty are willing to entertain directed research students in that area. And so for me, that tends to have been patent law. My interest in privacy law has actually only occurred in the last couple of years, so I'm actually looking forward to working with some students in privacy law, but I haven't done that. I've done actually some work with some folks in law and psychology and sort of jury decision making as directed research projects as well.
Yeah, and I would say almost every semester I have at least one student who I'm working with on a directed research project. And so, for example, this semester, a student is doing work on trademark protection for cannabis companies, which is a fascinating topic. So that's a great one, and I love doing it because usually you get some students will come and say, here's the thing I'm really interested in, but there's not a class on it, or I want to go deeper on this thing. So it's really fun, and I always learn a lot, and hopefully I think students learn a lot doing it. But almost every faculty member has opportunities for these research projects, and Professor Chow and I, as you said, do it all the time.
Thank you. So I just have one more question before I'm going to turn it back over to Yvonne. It's a little bit more of a generalized question, but can you talk about maybe just the unique culture and learning environment of Denver Law? And if you feel that the law school is integrated with the overall university?
Yeah, I mean, we can probably both speak to this. So I think that there are a couple things, some of which we've already mentioned. One thing that I find continually really striking about DU Law School is its close ties to the legal community. And so that's, as I've already said, sort of manifested with lawyers from Denver coming and teaching our students regularly, both as adjunct faculty members and occasionally as guest speakers and so on. So I think that that's is really distinct about DU, and it really sets us apart. There are only 2 law schools in Colorado, and we're the only law school in Denver. And it really provides our students with this incredible sort of, I really think, incredible opportunities. And I think that our students sort of reflect that. So one thing that I think is really unique about DU students is that they're really sort of entrepreneurial, and I can even see this in the questions that everyone is asking, like, how can I get involved? What can I get out of this experience, and how can I make it work for me? And I think what we do at Denver Law is really try to be responsive to those, all of those kinds of requests. So I think that's one of the reasons why we've developed such a strong experiential learning program across all kinds of areas. So I think those are at least some of the things that I think are really unique to and special about DU.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that's, I can compare DU to other law schools is that we really do put a focus on sort of the newest methods, to be honest. It sounds sort of in giving folks not just lecture classes, but sort of learning by doing kind of classes, which is the phrase these days is experiential learning. So we do a lot of that. And that means you end up working with a lot of folks in practice. I wasn't sure if the question was also directed to the greater campus as a whole. I don't know if I have a good perspective. When I was a law student, frankly, I only knew other law students. I did not really deal with the rest of campus. As a professor, I actually have it's taken me a few years, but I have good relationships with other areas now, because there are, a lot of interesting work is done, I think, interdisciplinary. So I actually work with folks in the psychology department as well as folks in the engineering department, because I think, for example, jury decision making obviously has psychological implications. Data security obviously has a lot of implications for computer science. A lot of the work I do is actually pretty data intensive. So I actually work with a statistician in the math department. So there's a lot there. And I noticed that there's one question that it's been posted a couple of times, whether there's a sizable market for patent litigation. So let me get to that quickly. Obviously, so first of all, patent litigation is very, very different from patent prosecution. About, I'd say, the population of attorneys who do patent prosecution is vastly larger than patent litigation. Denver obviously has a vibrant market for prosecution. It also has a pretty sizable market for patent litigation. But if you compare it to New York or LA or San Francisco, the answer would be it's much smaller. But but I don't think it's I don't think it's much smaller than other cities of the rough size. And there's a fairly robust number of litigators in town.
Thank you. When it comes to taking or considering taking the patent bar, what is your recommendation for students who do not have the STEM background? Is a bachelor's in science or tech field required?
So for the patent bar itself, yes, it's required. And so, I mean, we've had a couple of students that were just missing the credit degree requirement, other credit requirement. Like, so sometimes even if you don't have a bachelor's degree, you can do it with, I've taken a lot of science. I was actually a pre-med student, although I got a psychology degree. We've had 1 or 2 students actually finish up the coursework there. For the most part, they choose not to be patent prosecutor, honestly, if there's a lot left. But there is a lot of intellectual property, that does not involve representing clients to get patents, right? And that is the limitation.
Okay. Professor Moffitt, did you have a comment?
No, that's
Okay.
Professor Chow is the patent expert.
Professor Chow mentioned that students have a better chance of getting paid in externships if they've taken the patent bar. Was that with regards to only students who want to pursue patent law,
Yeah,
Or
yeah. So, yeah.
do
So
you want
that's
to
clearly
go a
what
different route? Within IP law, do you still have a chance of getting paid in externships?
yes. So I will say, once you come to the law school, and if you're actually one of the students that is interested in patent law, you will learn relatively quickly that you're a little, at least financially, luckier than others. And that is that your opportunities come in a little earlier than some of your counterparts. And particularly if you have I sort of joke, but it's true that if you have a background in, say, electrical engineering, computer science, or a PhD in molecular biology, you have the golden ticket, right? And we do have students every year, not many, but every year we have 1 or 2 students that have a golden ticket. And they can quickly get an externship or an internship because of their technical specialty. So for those students, yes, getting the patent background, patent bar early is very helpful. There are lots of other jobs, both intellectual property and outside intellectual property, where we do place students and students get internships. Sometimes it's not, it's often not as early. So a lot of the patent students will get them after the first year if they have the really special technical backgrounds that are highly sought after.
Okay.
But there's still lots of opportunities for other students to get paid and unpaid externships for credit. So there's the narrow slice of patent bar people is great, but there are lots of other jobs and opportunities out there.
Thank you. We're almost at the 10-minute point. So we have 4 questions left. So May will take the next 2 and I'll take the last 2.
Great. So how do you expect the program to evolve in the near and more long term? As, for example, do you think that it'll shift accordingly to technology trends like AI?
I think so. I think we're always changing, sort of at the edges, and of the program. For example, I said we offer these capstone courses, and those do change over time, both depending on kind of what's going on out in practice and what our adjunct faculty want to teach, and what students are interested in. And we do regularly, the law school, add new courses based on student interest. I think some of the basics are going to stay there, and we keep incorporating new cases and new issues into those basic courses, the intellectual property survey and so on. We've added privacy law and some more privacy offerings. I think that really reflects changes out there in the world. So I would say incremental rather than massive change, but incremental probably every year, and it absolutely has to respond to changes in what's happening in the world.
Yeah, I think the first step, and the step that's already happening, is that we're trying to become better at teaching, giving a more robust offering in privacy. So we have a regular data privacy course. We're now trying to offer a little more than that. We offered a cybersecurity practicum this past year for the first time. I'd like to see us do a little more than that. I think I predicted for years a floodgate of new privacy attorneys in the marketplace. I think I probably was a little too early when I said that. I still predict a floodgate of privacy attorneys in the market, but it hasn't hit yet. I recently, I shouldn't say, maybe a few months ago, I had lunch with Schwab's, I think it was Schwab's, either Schwab or Fidelity's privacy attorney, who was actually based in the Denver metro area. And I was shocked to learn he was Schwab's privacy attorney. And to me, it sounded crazy that they would have one person that was primarily in charge. And he admitted that it was crazy, right? So it was wrong and things had to change. And I think we have a lot of companies in that situation.
Great, thank you. And this might be a question for both of you. How do you feel DU's IP program compares to that of CU's program?
I'm definitely not going to say anything bad about CU. CU is a great law school. I think that sort of the things we've said before are really things that that set DU apart in terms of our connections to the local legal community, and that includes the intellectual property legal community. Our students really benefit by being in Denver and so both physically closer and just with the number of DU alums in Colorado. I think half of the practicing lawyers in Colorado are DU alums. I think that really sets us apart. But they're great people at CU, and you know,
Yeah, I would say
maybe I'll stop there.
there were the CU was so a lot of CU students historically have actually practiced outside the state, and DU has actually been much more sort of Colorado's feeder of attorneys, and that's why we have sort of the relationships that we do with the local community, and why it's so strong.
Great, thank you.
Does the program touch on the policy aspects of IP law around issues with current regulations and potential improvements? And then it goes on to, in addition to possibly taking the patent bar, are there other things you can recommend doing over the summer to prepare for law school?
Well, with respect to the first question, absolutely, yes. I think you cannot, I mean, this is true in all areas. I think it's impossible to talk about the law without talking about policy, or at least it's really boring to talk about the law without talking about the surrounding policy issues. And I mean, that's probably the thing that I like about intellectual property law, is that the policy issues are really acute, really important, and frankly, the sort of the developments in the intellectual property world, not the law, but what's happening in the world, moves so fast that the law can't keep up. And sort of thinking through the policy questions is really the only way that you can figure out, well, how does a law that was drafted in 1978 apply to AI? For example. And so thinking about policy is really the only way to make it work, to make it interesting. So absolutely, yes, in every class.
Thank you. Is there a sizable market for patent litigation in Denver? I've heard that the patent lit market isn't large in Denver.
I think I answered that question earlier. What was that?
With respect to what you can do over the summer, I guess I shouldn't, Professor Chow can speak to the patent bar. Otherwise, I would say, take a break, be well rested, and, I don't know, read some good books. And if you want suggestions of like law review articles, really reach out to me and I'll send you things. But I don't know about the patent bar.
Well, so I mean, obviously, the patent bar is a good step in developing specific skills and credentials that employers will like. I mean, I do think I would take a middle ground as far as I actually think there's a lot of interesting stuff to read that is both interesting and might be helpful for careers specifically involved in technology that aren't as dense necessarily as law review articles that may be hard to read at this point. And we could point you to a few of them, but I think, and I may have to update my reading list, but I think something like Code by Larry Lessig would be a really a great book to read. Another author that I would follow is someone named Tim Wu. And those are, I think, they write books that are meant for regular people, but yet they have lots of legal implications. And once you actually start studying intellectual property law, you go, oh, wow, I totally get the sort of deeper level. And so there's this sort of initial level of sort of the educated tech consumer. And then as you become, as you learn more and more about the law, there's a sort of a deeper level that they're talking to. And so I think those books are sort of fascinating to read and then reread later on.
Right, no, that's true. There are some great sort of sort of more layperson books written by law professors. There's a book, I can't remember the title now, but written by a law professor named Orly Lobel about, L-O-B-E-L, about the fight between Bratz and Barbie, in the intellectual property fight between Bratz and Barbie. So that's a great, if you just want a good story that has to do with intellectual property law, that's a great one.
Thank you.
And that's
We're
good
down-
for talents want to be freer.
Yeah.
Okay.
We're down to 3 minutes. Last question. Does your STEM background need to be recent, say within the past 5 years, to help you with finding opportunities?
No.
Okay.
I mean, I think it's not that they're going to expect you to, if you were to code, what employers want you to be is familiar with technology, not afraid of technology. Truthfully, I think the technical requirements in patent law, in patent prosecution, is probably not necessary, but it does sift away those people that are sort of scared of technology. If you're willing to learn and not afraid of it, you will do fine.
And one of the admitted students writes to everyone he'd recommend The Nine and The Oath. They are great books on the Supreme Court of the United States by Jeff Toobin, Toobin. So anything in closing? You each have 1 minute before we hit the 2 o'clock mark.
As I said, please email me if you have any questions and want to chat, or, you know, I do have lots of book recommendations of all kinds. I hope you, I wish you good luck with your decision. I hope to see you all in the fall.
And obviously, if you know, we've covered this in a way that is trying to sort of not very to be general for a generalized audience of intellectual property students, but if people have specific questions and want to have range for specific discussions, I think we're both available.
Absolutely.
Thank you both. That was wonderful. I learned so much, and I've been out of law school for quite a while now. So thank you.
All right.
May?
I have nothing else from me. Thank you so much to everyone who came. Thank you to our wonderful panelists, and thank you to Yvonne for helping me host this event. And if you do have any questions, Professor Chow's information, Professor Moffat's information is listed in our group chat right now. And if you have any other questions or forget to write them down, feel free to contact your admissions office and we'll be happy to connect you.
Thank
All
you,
right, take care.
everyone. Have a good Tuesday. Be safe.
Thank you.